Now we look at another very interesting and instructive game against Oleg Korneev, played in the last round of the Open tournament in Linares. Both of the players had to win this game in order to be able to fight for the first prize, and that make an influence on the character of the game. After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, exchange on d4, knight d4, g6, c4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop e2, knight d4, queen d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, castle, queen d2, bishop e6, castle, queen a5. White chose another setup, and he played rook a b1. As you can see, there are several different ways for white to play for the initiative and for the advantage, but none of them promises anything special, especially after white has castled the king's side. And the move that was played by Korneev against me allows black directly simplify the game, playing rook fc8. Now the pawn on c4 is under attack, and after b3, knight g4. If white here plays knight d2, then after queen d2, bishop d2, king f8, all problems for black are solved. For example, after knight g5, knight f6 is possible, and the rising ending is absolutely equal. So in the present game, Oleg Korneev chose the recommendation of Ivanchuk and played bishop d4. I exchanged on d4, and after queen d4 played queen c5, driving away the white queen from the very important square d4. Please note that the strategical idea of white in this position was to exchange on d4, and after taking on d4 play knight d5. So basically it is necessary to avoid such exchange. Of course, it was possible, instead of queen c5, play knight f6 immediately, and only afterwards queen c5. Basically it doesn't change the course of the game and makes no influence. So I played queen c5. The queen now has to return back, because in the ending white has no any chance of getting the advantage whatsoever. So he plays queen d3. After queen d2, knight f6, black continues the realization of the same plan, playing a5, bishop d7, and then bishop c6. So queen d3, and now knight f6. It is much more accurate than knight e5, because after knight e5, white can play queen g3, and afterwards king h1, threatening immediate advance of the pawn f2 to f4, f5, and f6. So knight f6, and after king h1, black has to do something special in order to prevent all possible play of white once and forever. The bishop on e6 has played its role, and now it has to be moved. As you have already seen, the similar ideas were used by me in my game against Leka, when also at some point I spent several tempi, but transferring the bishop from e6 to c6, where it was attacking the central pawn e4. And here again, bishop d7, f4. It makes no sense for white to play b4, because after queen c7, the pawn on c4 is weak, and when this pawn is weakened, there is no way for white to play for initiative in the king side or in the center. Black has more than enough counterplay. So f4 is a normal move, and now I have to play a5. Bishop c6 is not so good, because white can play b4 and e5, getting the large advantage. So a5. The idea of this move is to create counterplay, as we know with the move a4, as a basic strategical idea that you have already learned. The correct move in this position for white is bishop f3, for example, after which black has a choice between a4 or bishop c6, with equal chances in both cases, or rook b1, after which black has the choice between bishop c6 and a4. But in the game, white wanted to prevent all possible play on the queen side, and he made a4. But actually this move is a mistake, because the pawn structure on the queen side becomes fixed, and despite that no further play for black is available on this part of the board, white remains with a bad bishop on e2. And as we can see during the later course of the game, eventually white lost because he has started creating weaknesses in his camp. So bishop c6, knight d5, and here I played rook e8. Of course, it was possible to took on d5, and after e d5 the position is equal. It is extremely difficult for white to make further progress, but the same is also valid for black. The pawn structure on the queen side is black, and if black at some point plays e6 on e5, then white has no problem whatsoever, and maybe even he can play for a slight plus. But the tournament situation during this game forced me to keep tension on the board, and that's why I played rook e8, allowing white to spoil my pawn structure and to take on f6. But when white takes on f6, he has to defend the pawn on e4 permanently, and the weakness on e4 is being compensated by my weakness on d6, and the position is equal. The same is valid that after knight b1, black can play rook d8, or he can play knight d7, trying to play e6 at some point with equal chances. The game continued rook b d1 or rook a d8. It was possible to play knight d7 as well. Knight d7, white has the move bishop g4, and I didn't like that much, so I played the text move rook d8. And here white committed a very serious mistake, and he played h4, seriously weakening the king side. It was already necessary to take on f6, and after ef6 play bishop e3 with equal chances. But the tournament situation forced my opponent to play for a win, and now black is able to seize over the initiative, using the fact that white has already weakened his king side, having played h4. So I exchange on d5, and after e d5 I play e6. If white exchanges on e6, then black seizes over the control over e file, and the square e4 is weak and the square e3 is weak. Black is better. Not wishing to open the e line, white takes the bishop d5 with a c pawn, but it has another drawback, that now the e4 pawn becomes a target, and black is able to seize the line c, playing queen b4, attacking the pawn on e4. The point of this move that e5 is not possible, because not only the pawn on d5 hanging, but also black can take the pawn on h4 first, winning. So the only move is bishop e3, and now rook c8. Rook c3 is a threat, and if black plays now e5, then there is knight d7 at his disposal. Although it is possible to win the pawn d5, f5, queen h4, and after king g1, knight d7, black is better. So basically white has to play rook c1. Now I exchange on c1, and after rook c1 I play e5. Here you can see that the type of the play transposes from one part of the board to another. Several moves ago I was playing on the queen side, and now I am playing in the center. If white takes the pawn on e5, then I take, of course, this pawn with the rook, and as you can see how bad the bishop on f3, which is forced forever to defend the pawn on e4. As you probably, this position is strategically winning for black, although it is still not easy to convert this positional advantage into a full point. In the game, white decided to exchange on e6, and after rook e6, he has the serious problem how to defend this pawn on e4, because rook c4 loses not only one pawn but even 2 pawns on h4 and f4. Probably the best move here is queen c2, but then after queen c2, black has queen d2. As you can see, all the pawns on the king side are weak, and black is able to exploit it. But the game continued king h2, and this allowed me to play d5, transpose one sort of advantage into another. Again, the pawn on f4 hangs, and after the first move e d5, I play queen f4, g3, king h3 loses after rook e3, and after g3, I play rook e3, exchanging the queens, and after g f4, rook d3, you can see how many weaknesses there are in the white camp. The pawn on h4, the pawn on f4, the pawn on d5, and the pawn on b3. Usually 2 weaknesses are enough for a win, and here in this position white has 4 weaknesses. The position is won, nevertheless there are some technical difficulties, and here we see how easily black converts his advantage into a full point. Knight d5, rook c8, probably it was better to play rook c5, although still after knight e7, rook e5, rook b3, black should win with the threat knight e5, and later knight h4. So my opponent played rook c8, king g7, and he exchanged the rooks by rook d8. Knight f4, rook d3, knight d3, bishop b7. But the pawns b3 and a4 are blocked by one pawn a5. Here you see what as a result of the mistake of white before. He is no longer able to create a passed pawn here, and black has 2 pawns more on the king side, and because of that he wins the game without much problems. King f3, king f6, the king is going into center, winning the tempo, attacking the pawn on b3, bishop d5, king e5, and now we can advance the pawns on the king's side. The domination of the knight on c5 is strong, the pawns are being advanced, and even giving up the knight does not help white at all. The pawns of black are being promoted. So here black resigned. I hope you have liked this very interesting and nice game, very instructive. Now you know what to do with black in the similar positions.